Hello, Environmental Policy 1 students. Professor Conway here for your first lesson by way of a lecture video, as is indicated in our course description and so on. So we will be relying a lot both on lecture videos and on Zoom calls as we go through, in addition to what other elements you have in your weekly lesson plans, okay? So this lesson 1 is on conceptual frameworks. All right, let me get me set up here. Conceptual frameworks, and the reason I want you to be aware of this discussion is much of what we can understand in environmental policy and the politics of environmental policy, the political economy of environmental policy can be thought about in the context of these conceptual frameworks that I'm going to talk to you about today, okay? You'll see the concepts on that second page to go through. You know, the concepts that you should be looking for as you go through these slides, but also in your reading, okay? But let me take you through these. First, I'm going to start with economics basics, because obviously a major challenge for environmental policy, no matter where you live, is the interaction of the relationships between the economic system and the environmental system. And then within that, of course, is the governance system that both deals with the economy and with the environment. And how well a society becomes green, of course, is how well we can integrate the environment and the economy and make decisions that are more sensitive to environmental protection and sustainability. But let's deal with the basic concepts first. First, I want to talk about economics basics, and I will situate your course in this program in this discussion, okay? So economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources among alternative competing objectives. Two concepts are critical to the understanding of the basics of economics: scarcity and opportunity cost. When these two concepts are considered, you understand a major rationale for economics. If we don't apply economics to major decisions, we might end up serving less important objectives and using all our scarce resources before addressing more important objectives. You can see environmental policy in that, right? I mean, how we exploit the environment. Are we doing it in a harmful way? Are we leaving a rich natural environment for future generations? How are we spending our natural assets? Okay, is an important consideration. Let's look at the schools of economic thought, because that's where we begin to understand where environment fits into the dominant or predominant paradigms of economics in capitalist societies, okay? Three critical questions guide economic inquiry. What ends do we desire? What limited or scarce resources do we need to attain those ends? What ends get priority, and to what extent should we allocate resources to them? We can use these three questions or criteria to discuss the main schools of economic thought, and we will discuss how those relate to the environment, okay? Neoclassical Economics, which is one of the predominant schools of economic thought in capitalist society, right? It's the big one. It's Friedman. It's all the big economists that have focused on both macro and microeconomics, right? Traditionally, economists have said that the answer to the first question is utility, or human welfare. So for a neoclassical economist, the first question, what ends do we desire, is all about human utility, human consumption, human welfare. Okay? Human welfare is revealed by preferences in the free market transactions. All right? And the assumption being here that those free market transactions should always be free, largely unregulated. Okay? And of course, we often use regulation to protect the environment, don't we, right? So when you see a free marketer like Donald Trump elected to president, what's the first thing he does with respect to environmental policy? He identifies it as a barrier to the free market application. Okay, so they whittle away at some environmental protections. All right. With respect to the second question, Q2, what limited or scarce resources do we need to achieve these ends? And that's determined by supply and demand in this school of thought, right? I mean, if there's supply and there's demand, resources will go towards meeting that supply and demand equation. Okay, the market determines the apportioning of resources to the production of different goods and services, known as the invisible hand of the market. Okay? The same invisible hand discharges obligations to consider the third question as well. What ends get priority? To what extent should we allocate resources to them? And in this school of thought, humans are assumed to be insatiable. And that's not a bad thing, because that insatiability plays itself out in the free market. Okay, and supply and demand, free choice, largely unobstructed economic activity. Okay, so as such, unending economic growth is typically considered an adequate, measurable proxy for the priority desired end, continual growth, right? Economics, if you don't grow, you're dead, is the motto that they. If a neoclassical economist was going to have a tattoo on their chest, that might be it, right? However, this logic only reveals preferences for market goods and implicitly discounts non-market goods. And what does that mean to us? Because most of the environment is not a market good, right? We don't have birdies don't fly by with price tags on them. The river doesn't flow by with a price tag on it, right? The wildlife for the grizzly bear doesn't, you don't walk into grizzly bear territory and a big sign that's got a price tag on it, right? All of these things are not market goods and services. Therefore, what does not get counted does not get taken into consideration, right? So neoclassical economics assumes that markets reveal most desired ends and that most scarce resources are market goods, not the environment. And the mechanism for allocating resources to alternate ends is the free market. All right? Now, whenever we lay out a school's broad theoretical propositions, of course, we're not being fair to all the subtleties of sub-schools and so on, but the key messages I'm making for you here is that neoclassical economics has that emphasis, and we see it. Let's face it. You read the Financial Post, you read the Globe and Mail, you read relatively right or center right newspapers, and you're seeing it all the time, right? Oh, public state expenditure, a bad thing. Regulation, a bad thing. These are all the foundations of neoclassical economics. Okay. Now, welfare economics, the other dominant school of economic thought in our society today, all right? Whereas neoclassical economics adopts the invisible hand theorem, whereby supply and demand and competition in a free market leads to efficient allocation of resources determined by the utility function. Humans get what they want. It largely turns a blind eye to market inefficiencies and perverse outcomes of free markets, right? Including unnecessary damage to the environment. For welfare economics, free markets do not always lead to social optimum outcomes or explicit desired ends, right? So there's the welfare economists adopt many of the propositions of traditional economics, neoclassical economics, but they add the welfare dynamic, okay? What we call welfare economics, okay? Indeed, while neoclassical economics suggests that no government intervention is required for the market to perform its utility maximizing function, welfare economics argues that markets can and often do result in perverse outcomes. And that points to government policy actions or the need for government corrective measures. Okay? As an environment person, we would certainly agree with that proposition, right? A completely free market, unregulated with respect to the environment, what would our environment look like? Let's face it, it won't be pretty. All right? So, for instance, a situation where someone holds every good and the rest of the population holds none would be a Pareto efficient distribution in the neoclassical logic, right? It would be. That would be the most efficient state would be somebody or a group of people that could direct all of their resources, wouldn't it, right? So, if you follow that logic through, if you follow the neoclassic logic through, then we would have in reality, a pretty harsh existence, wouldn't we? Obviously, this situation can hardly be considered as perfect under any definition of social welfare, and we haven't gotten to environmental welfare yet. As such, welfare economics is concerned with introducing redistributive aspects into economic decision-making, and not simply relying on free market allocation. Welfare economics is concerned with the relationship between market efficiency, the neoclassical part of welfare economics, and welfare distribution considerations. A move away from laissez-faire to government policy interventions for public welfare. All right, so we're starting to move into, this neoclassical presentation we're going to make most environmentalists pretty uneasy, right? The welfare economics, okay, you're beginning to talk my language, but the welfare economics still focusing largely on human welfare, public welfare, all right? So welfare economics, the answers to the three questions are less freehand of the market. So let's look at that. What ends do we desire? Economic growth, efficiency, and utility maximization in the free market remain important, but more concern for redistributed benefits to social welfare. What limited or scarce resources do we need to attain these ends? A greater share of societal resources move through state intervention to support broader social welfare in addition to markets. What ends get priority, and to what extent should we allocate resources to them? Government plays a bigger role in setting priorities in support of markets and social welfare objectives. That's largely the broad parameters of the way a welfare economist would see things. Okay? Now let's look at a political economist, which is my background. Okay? Before some 20-some years ago, I started to invest more heavily in environmental economics in the UN and so on. So political economy is concerned with the interplay between politics, society, and economics. Political economists believe that the separation between the study of politics and economics is an artificial one. The state creates the condition for organized economic activity in society, and the economy creates the resources necessary for the state. Okay? When you introduce this notion, you suddenly are introducing a political system into the discussion, because the economy cannot exist in its current form devoid of the political system's support, and vice versa. But because of the political system is now engaged, and we live in a liberal democracy, right, where the people will have some say over what's going on, and the people have some say over their interest in the environment, we see in this model more and more environment beginning to creep into the discussion, in addition to social welfare, in addition to racial equality, and a number of other things that political economists over the years have really emphasized, okay? So the distribution of power and wealth between different groups and individuals, and the structures, laws, institutions, processes that create, sustain, and transform these relationships over time are all important. All right? Are all important to a political economist. And political economy, there are mainstream elements of political economy. I would call centrist or even centrist right political economists. But most of the political economic tradition has been the center left or the left, okay? Because the left has looked at the way the capitalist system maybe doesn't advance enough equity, equality, social justice, and environmental protection, all right? Whereas the center-right of the political spectrum for economists are more concerned with neoclassical economics and perhaps welfare economics, okay? In capitalist societies, for example, political economy would consider how the state, including laws, institutions, and processes, act to limit threats to the capitalist system. Okay? The state institutionalized bias against changes to the predominant economic system, especially those changes that threaten major unplanned upheaval to the economic system. We see the struggles around climate change, right? As the capitalist system tries to come to grips with climate change, and NGOs and progressive groups are saying, hey, we got to come to grips with this. We're seeing battles, right, between different broad economic notions, right? Can we take climate change into account and still have a good economy? On that side, right? Political economists, many welfare economists. On the other side, oh, climate change is going to kill us. We're not going to be competitive. Right? Neoclassical economics and some elements of welfare economics. Okay? Much of political economy is concerned with the question, how do we understand the difficulty of bringing about policy reforms that are desirable from a social societal welfare perspective? Why do they seem to be continually blocked? Poverty reduction and environmental protection are just two examples. Okay? Why do we still have street people? Right? Why do we still have a situation where on the one hand everybody's arguing we're environmentally pure, and then we're seeing tailings ponds leak into the groundwater? Why are we seeing, these are all the dynamics that you need to understand when you're studying environmental policy, right? For these reasons, the concepts and methods of the political economists are influential in environmental economics, right? Because suddenly you've got all the dynamics that environmental economics needs, right? To begin to flourish. And the environmental economists then came along, and they were primarily derived out of welfare economics and political economy, more heavily political economy. And they come along and they say, you know what our economic system doesn't do is account for the environment. Okay? And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that now. Okay? But first, in political economy, in summary, the political economist's response to our three questions would be, what ends do we desire? It misses the point, they say. The key is what power relationship restrict achieving desired ends. Okay? We're looking at those power relationships between government, the state, and the economics, right? What limited or scarce resources do we need to attain these ends? Resources are scarce, but the main point is that resources are controlled by few relative to the many, and this creates perceptions of scarcity that constrains positive change. Climate change. Let's say we want to act on climate change. What are the two dominant arguments you hear? Oh my God, we can't afford it. It's never going to happen, right? Yeah. Whereas we all know that if society was ready to mobilize its resources, we could do a lot, right? And then the other side, which can be equally as bad, is, oh, we can do anything. We have unlimited resources. These are the dynamics that are going on in political economy, okay? What ends get priority and to what extent should we allocate resources to them? The overarching priority for the powers that be is to sustain the current system. And political economists are saying, how do we overcome these barriers? Okay. Now, then we run into environmental and ecological economics. Ecological economics, I'm going to deal with some of their deep ecology concepts at the end of this lesson, okay? Because I want you to understand them, and I want you to understand them in distinction to environmental economics, okay? From an ecological economics perspective, environmental economics is simply a modification on traditional economics, which to a degree is correct, okay? From an ecological economist point of view, we need to introduce all kinds of new concepts. And we're going to talk about that in the end of these lessons. From an environmental economist perspective, ecological economics is too theoretical and abstract, with an emphasis on the limits to growth. And in other words, environmental economics, or the steady state economy and so forth. For environmental economists, their perspective is, how do we get the current system to better account for the environment and sustainability? All right? The current system, because the reality is that changing the current capitalist system is maybe a bridge too far. All right, so environmental economists, I would argue, try to practice in the practical world of incorporating environment into economic decision making. Ecological economists are paradigm shifting economists. They're people who try to transform the belief system about what our society should be trying to achieve with respect to sustainability or protecting the environment. So they talk about new concepts like carrying capacity, limits to growth, steady state economy, all of these kinds of things, whereas environmental economists are talking about taking environmental externalities into account, polluter pays, all of these other concepts that you've heard about, okay, and we'll talk about as we go through the course, okay. So, but what's common between ecological economics and environmental economics is that both of these schools of thought reintroduce the natural environment into economic decision making, okay. Whereas neoclassical economics and welfare economics see the economy as part of a closed system, right? If you look at any of their diagrams or any of their discussion, you would think the natural resources we get from the environment materialized by magic green guys from space, right? In a lot of cases, okay? Whereas neoclassical economics and welfare see the economy as a closed system, environmental economics obviously sees it as an open system, as does ecological economics. To the environmental economists, to function, the economy must extract resources from the environment and dispose large amounts of waste back into the environment. The natural environment is also not limitless and is transformed by economic activity. Two problems are at the core of environmental economics. The problem of environmental externalities, and we'll be talking about that in future lessons, the correct management of natural resources. Ecological economists would actually say the problem is there's too many of us, we're growing too fast, we have to find a way to limit strains on carrying capacity of the natural environment, we have to find a way to adopt a steady population, a steady state economy. Okay? Obviously, would be great if you're a true believer in the environment, but the reality is perhaps a mountain too tall to climb. Okay? So these two problems are considered from the perspective of how we can better account for the environment in economic decision making, and better yet, how accounting for the environment returns value to the economy and social welfare. All right? That's what we're concerned about here. So, in summary, the environmental economists would approach our three questions this way. What ends do we desire? Economic activities that meets the needs of society and is sustainable without irreversible harm to the environment. What limited or scarce resources do we need to attain these ends? Resources should only be used at a rate and in a way that is sustainable. Okay? What ends get priority, and to what extent should we allocate resources to them? The ultimate priority is to ensure economic activities take the environment fully into account from a sustainability perspective, an integration of economy and environment. Okay? And with the advent of climate change, you see these debates, right? We have to find a better way to live. We have to stop putting GHGs into the environment. We have to become more innovative in renewable energy. And it also occurs in biodiversity discussions, all kinds of discussions, right? And so we begin to see how these different paradigms battling in society will have different definitions of economics, and therefore different definitions of what is required to protect the environment. So natural capital. Let's look at some of the other key concepts that you need to be aware of. Natural capital. Two major distinctions out there, right? Human-made capital and natural capital. Okay? It's important. Both are really obviously relevant to the environment, okay? Because how we build human-made capital has environmental impacts, right? How fast we deplete natural capital has very significant impacts for sustainability, all right? So humans derive a wide range of services from the environment, often called ecosystem services, which make human life possible, known as natural capital. But the difficulty we have with this when we're dealing with economics and we're dealing with environmental policy is, like a lot of decision making in society is done by monetary values, right? By economic decision making in a traditional model. How do you get the environment fully into account, right? We'll be talking about all these policy instruments as we go along, right? Strategic environmental assessment, environmental impact assessment, environmental regulation, okay, market-based instruments, all of these things that we use to try to control environmental externalities and control the rate of depletion of natural capital. Okay, so natural capital is obvious things, right? Food we eat, water we drink, plant materials we use for fuel, building materials, medicines, you name it, okay? Less obvious, climate regulation, natural flood defenses provided by forests, billions of tons of carbon stored by peatlands, pollination of crops by insects, natural filtration system, wildlife, culture. All of these provide enormous value to the economy and to social well-being, right? How many of them are costed? How many of them are seriously taken into account when we make large-scale economic decisions in our society? Okay? So, both ecological and environmental economists say, we need to make sure that our built environment is more environmentally sound and that we're not depleting natural capital at an unsustainable rate. They have that in common, right? The second concept they have in common is carrying capacity, another key concept in environmental policy. The evolution of concerns about carrying capacity can be understood to have followed the progression of modern industrialization and global population explosion, right? Whereas before the Industrial Revolution, fish in the ocean were not threatened because a guy was going out there in a little boat and he was paddling out and he was throwing a line in the water, or he had a miniature handheld net, right? When the Industrial Revolution came along, if you look at the way ocean fishing is done now, they're large industrial scale ships that scoop up thousands of tons of fish as they're going by, right? The rates of exploitation due to industrial modernization just accelerated at a much faster rate even than population. Before, it used to take us a long time to collect our food. Now we go to the grocery store, we grab it because large manufacturing facilities and industrial facilities are now exploiting the natural capital, right? At a rate that we had never seen before in modern industrialization, right? Before the Industrial Revolution, human productive capacity could never have supported today's global population, right? Standard of living and rates of consumption would never have been sustainable. Never have been sustainable. Okay. However, with technological advances and industrial scale extraction of environmental resources, the world is challenging the globe's carrying capacity and its ecosystem services. Okay. And impossible to dispute this, right? Virtually impossible to dispute it. We are exploiting resources and we are killing off species at a rate much faster than we ever have in human history. And if we were to continue to live like this for another 100 years, it's going to be a pretty dystopic environment that we're living in, unless we bring about changes over that 100-year period to mitigate the negative impacts we're having on both the built environment and the natural environment. Okay. Limits to growth. This is where the environmental economists and the ecological economists both value this concept, but the ecological economist has put much more work into it because their change is very much a belief system change, right? With technology, so this concept goes like this: with technological advancement, population growth, industrial scale expansion, and global proliferation of commercialization, environmentalists point to the issue of limits to growth. Clearly, it is not possible to continue with current trends without hitting limits. We're already hitting limits. Now, we're already hitting limits on scarce resources, all right? Fresh water in a lot of countries, okay? Different types of food sources in a lot of countries. And there's a disagreement on how much we can overcome these limits to growth. And so another dominant breakdown in society is between what we call technological skepticism and technological optimism, okay? Technological optimists could be a hardcore environment person, but see the prospect for technological innovation to solve the problem. For example, a technological optimist would be a CEO of a renewable energy company, right? Somebody who sees that we still wants to sell as much power as they can, but will generate it cleanly. All right? And so that's the technological optimist. A technological skeptic would be a deep ecologist, economist, right? Deep ecological economist who says technology creates, every time we veer new technology, we think it's going to help us protect the environment or something else, actually ends up contributing to greater damage to the environment. For example, we can cultivate less land because we can more intensely produce crop on a smaller piece of land because of pesticides. Okay, so the pesticides, good, we didn't have to use as much land, but the pesticides themselves creating significant difficulties in killing off of bees, pollinators, and other public health problems and so on, right? So that's the dynamic that's going on there. And you can see it in press. Whenever people talk about environmental issues, right? Climate change, oh my God, we'll never do it, right? Or, yes, it can be done. So you'll see that dynamic going on when we discuss environmental policy as well. So, hardcore limits to growth advocates, technology is the source of the problems, or technology is a way to prevent or mitigate problems, is the split that we have in a lot of the debates that occur on the ecological and environmental economics side of things. Environmental economists would fall into the camp of technological optimism. Ecological economists would fall into the camp mostly of technological skeptics. Okay? There's different perspectives on carrying capacity and limits to growth and whether these facts can be overcome, right? These are the different perspectives. Like, can we overcome, or do we have to slow everything down? Do we have to bring in population control? Do we have to, what a lot of deep ecologists would argue, right? Environmental economists would say we have to get better at making decisions to protect the environment in our economic and social decision making, okay? And this is where the steady state economy is another key concept, but that's a concept that's largely owned by ecological economists. They've spent quite a bit of time figuring out how can we have a steady state economy. It's an economy of stable or mildly fluctuating size. In other words, we need to stop. We need to stop. We need to stop growing. We need to stop exploiting. We need to, etc. Okay? The advocates of this are technological skeptics and feel that technology creates as many problems as it solves. The concept is typically used to refer to a national economy, but can also be applied to local, regional, or global economies. People have tried it. Bhutan has tried to have the steady state economy. Okay? Birth rates equal death rates. Production rates equal depreciation rates. All of those factors come into the steady state economy. Minimizing waste allows for a steady state economy at higher levels of production and consumption, and so on. There are a bunch of concepts, but I'm not expecting you to be trained as an ecological economist, but I want you to understand the concepts. And then finally, we have that major concept of sustainable development that I'm sure you're all aware of. And this one is clearly the camp of the environmental economist and the environmental policy person who accepts that society, we're not going to be able to stop what society's dominant modus operandi is, but we need to work as hard as we can to improve environmental protection in that context, okay? Everybody knows or should know about our common future. Sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, right? Sustainable development acknowledges the problems of technology in terms of harm to the environment, but also shares in technological optimism. We can overcome. We can invent renewable energy. We can make what we're doing sustainable. However, that might be a pipe dream for some ecological economists. You know, it's the dominant, still to this day, is the dominant environmental/economics paradigm on the environmentalist side of the political spectrum today. Okay, the concept of sustainable development can be interpreted in different ways, but its core is an approach to development that looks to balance different and often competing needs against an awareness of the environmental, social, cultural, and economic limitations we face as society. In other words, we have limitations. So let's plan around those limitations. Let's do better at handling the environment. Let's do better at controlling pollution as we do the things that a dominant capitalist economic society would normally do. But just get better at it, get cleaner at it, get greener at it. All the concepts you've heard about. And unfortunately, all the concepts that can sometimes appear in greenwashing, right? We're a green company, right? Or we're this or we're that. All of those. So anything that becomes dominant in terms of a change agent, like Sustainable Development Society, is going to be misrepresented at times, right? But if you read Our Common Future, you can see there's a lot of value there. But unfortunately, the concept gets confused as it gets churned in the dominant debates of the day. Okay, and this last concept is all I wanted to do is ecological footprint is make the point that, you know, as environmental economists, as sustainable development advocates, many tools have spun out, right? Green design, all of these things. And one of the dominant ones are ecological footprint, right? Coming out of the sustainable development movements, tools began to be developed to better inform economic decision making, at least regarding taking environmental social responsibility into account. One such tool is the concept of ecological footprint. It measures ecological assets, natural capital, that a population or entity requires to produce a man-made capital, plant-based food and fiber, livestock and fish products, timber, and so on, and to absorb the waste generated by consumption. This is just one tool. I just want to give you the sense that I'm not touching all of the tools or methodologies that are out there that have sprung out of sustainable development movement, sprung out of the environmental economics movement. Okay. So on that, we'll finish lesson 1. You know, we will look for my video for lesson 2 next week. And have a good week. And I'm sure I'll be talking to you soon. Okay? Take care for now. Bye-bye now.